So European 1500 was a place of great change, and in the previous video we looked at how the Renaissance, this period of a rebirth of interest in the world, a rebirth in finding out new knowledge and new understanding about the world, was happening in the Italian states, particularly around Florence. And this was creating a kind of scientific and cultural and artistic explosion of ideas. Now, at the same time, there were other important events happening elsewhere in Europe, and I want to focus on this video by looking at what was happening in Spain. Now, in Spain, had been divided for several centuries between the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. But at the end of the 15th century, this division was brought to an end by the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella, who united those two kingdoms together. And this laid foundations for Spain to become a kind of global superpower. But that's another story. We want to look at the start of this journey of Spain's expansion, and it all came initially thanks to this chap here, who was an Italian from Genoa, a chap called Christopher Columbus. You might have heard of him, and he approached Queen Isabella. He'd actually been around all of the major courts in Europe, all the kings and queens were powerful princes in Italy, and he'd asked them to fund a journey which he wanted to take, and they'd all thought that he was a little bit mad, and they'd said no. But he took his proposition to the Spanish courts, to particularly Queen Isabella, who seemed to be interested in his plight and in his tales, and he made this suggestion to her, his business proposition to Queen Isabella. Now, a lot of people at the end of the 15th century believed that the Earth was flat, that if you sailed too far west from Spain, that you would actually just fall off the edge of the world and be eaten by dragons or whatever terrible monsters lurked at the edge of the world. But some more enlightened thinkers, some people who studied the world, they kind of looked at the horizon and they thought, well, hang on a second, that horizon looks quite curved to me. Why can't, if the world's flat, I should be able to see forever, and I can't. It kind of curves away. And lots of people began to think, looking at the moon, that maybe actually the Earth was a globe, was spherical, was round, and you didn't actually fall off the edge. And Christopher Columbus, he was one of these people who believed this, who believed that the Earth was round. So his proposition to Queen Isabella was, he said, look, if you can fund me to have lots of ships, well, maybe not lots of ships, maybe just 3 ships, and then what I can do is I can sail from Spain across the Atlantic Ocean to get to all of the spice markets that exist in India and Asia and modern day China. Because at the time there was a flourishing trade between Europe and Asia, especially for spices, which rich people would use to flavour their meats. This is before refrigerators, so meat would be stored in salt, and then and quite often would still have quite a mature, rich taste to it, because it was hard to stop it from going off a bit. So rich people, to cover up this bad flavour, or to cover up the saltiness, would add lots of spices to their meats. And so spices were very valuable commodities, and anybody who traded them made lots of money. So what Christopher Columbus was saying to Queen Isabella is saying, look, instead of taking the long, dangerous journey across land from Spain to India or to China, why don't we just take the simple journey around the world, where we can sail across the Atlantic Ocean arrive in India or China, trade for spices, and then sell back again, and then we can still sell them for a huge profit, and we'll get very rich. Queen Isabella thought this was a wonderful idea, and thought the idea of the adventurous idea of this was wonderful, and so she agreed, independent of King Ferdinand, who thought the idea was a bit nuts. She agreed to fund Christopher Columbus's adventure across the Atlantic Ocean, and many of his sailors were terrified that they were going to fall off the edge of the world, but they sailed onwards anyway, and they sailed around the world. Now they finally made landfall, and when Christopher Columbus made landfall, he believed that he had reached China or India, or the Indies as they called it, and so that's why nowadays that area of the world where he landed is still called the West Indies. That the native people of the lands that he discovered became known as Indians, because Christopher Columbus thought he'd landed in India. And until the day he died, even though he made multiple return visits to the islands and the lands that he discovered, he still believed that he'd actually landed near India or near China. So, but he hadn't. He had actually discovered a whole new continent, a whole new world, and it became known as the New World. The poor indigenous population, they weren't used to the many diseases that the new people had brought over from Europe, and they died in their millions from diseases like smallpox, which they brought over. And this is a tragic story. The story of what happened to the indigenous peoples of the Americas, and it's a story that we can learn later on in history. But for now, for our story about what's happening in Europe, the fact that Christopher Columbus and subsequent travellers had discovered this whole new continent, this whole new world, fed in to that thinking that was happening in Italy at the time, that actually all the tradition that had happened for almost 2,000 years, since when Europe was being controlled by the Catholic Church, and it was accepted that the only knowledge you ever needed to know was in the Bible, that God created everything, God was the explanation for everything, was just accepted, and people didn't look for new knowledge. Tradition was what was successful in life. Suddenly, with the Renaissance in Italy, but now also with the discovery of this whole new world, people began to think, actually, if what we thought we knew, understood the world in the past isn't true anymore, and actually we should question more, we should find out more about the world we live in, and that will lead to greater knowledge, greater understanding. In the case of Spain, it led to greater riches, especially in South America. The new Spanish settlers that followed after Christopher Columbus, they discovered huge reserves of gold, and this gold was carried back in huge treasure ships to Spain, and it was one of the key reasons why Spain grew into a massive and powerful empire that was to dominate European history, and to some extent English history, for the next few hundred years.